We started this program in 2003 with the hope of having an impact on a problem facing all humanity. And after 14 years of running this energy and environment program, U.S. energy consumption has risen to only 10% renewables. So it's with mixed emotions, given the toll of recent hurricane activity on our country, that I say I hope this is a teachable moment for us all. 10 years ago, in 2007, McKinsey did an analysis that showed we had the necessary technologies to reduce greenhouse gases by 2030 to levels below year 2005. Yet we're not making this progress. CO2 has now exceeded 405 parts per million, and CO2 equivalent emissions, including methane and other bad stuff, have risen over 40% since 1991. So tonight's topic is particularly important and urgent because technology alone is not enough to fix our pollution problem. With the increasing recognition of global environmental devastation from human pollution and of the climate crisis due to recent hurricanes, it's most timely to assess why we are unable to affect the necessary changes in emissions. There's a clear linkage between our emissions and the financial and economic incentives at place in our society. And there's further linkage between those incentives and our political process. Professor Knittel is going to help us understand the incentives at work and evaluate some policy alternatives. It is clear that his policy insight is part of the missing link between our technologies and our behavior. Chris is the George P. Shultz Professor. Some people say the Charles Schultz, but that's a different guy. And a professor of applied economics at the MIT Sloan School. Prior to MIT Sloan, he taught at the University of California at Davis and at Boston University, and his research focuses on industrial organization, environmental economics, and applied econometrics. And there's a bunch of other impressive stuff that you can read about in the bio. He is working right now with the Massachusetts legislature on adoption of a carbon tax, which I think is an important initiative. And he also chairs several important groups at MIT, which he will tell you about shortly. So please join me in welcoming Professor Knittel. Chris?
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Let me just tell you the hats that I wear at MIT. So as was mentioned, my main job is I'm the George P. Shultz Professor of Applied Economics, so that's in the Sloan School. And then I wear three other hats. The first of those three is I'm also the director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT. And this is what I like to describe it as the hub for social science and policy work related to energy and environment. It's been around for 40 years. We're celebrating our 40-year anniversary today, or this year. And then the second is I'm also the co-director of the Electric Power System Low Carbon Energy Center. And if you've been following MIT, about a year and a half ago we came out with the Climate Action Plan, which formed 8 new low carbon energy centers at MIT through the MIT Energy Initiative. Most of those are technology focused. The one that I like to say brings all those technologies together is the Electric Power System Low Carbon Energy Center. And what I don't have on here is I'm also co-director of what's called the E2E project. This is actually a joint venture between MIT, UC Berkeley across the bay, and the University of Chicago. And the focus of the E2E project is to understand the costs and benefits of energy efficiency. And whenever possible, to do that by running actually randomized field trials or randomized control trials with energy efficiency investments. So that's where I'm coming at these sorts of issues. I'm an economist, a card-carrying economist. which is why I support a carbon tax, and that'll be in more than one slide, I'm sure. But I also come at this from the technology side and how to integrate these technologies, how to create the right incentives for low carbon technologies to be adopted. So I'm going to focus on, really, the focus of my talk is on differences. So the first is, how is climate change different than any other environmental issue that we've faced? And then the second is, how are climate change related policies different? Okay, so that's the place where I'm going to discuss different alternatives that we have at our disposal to incentivize low carbon technologies and how different policies differ in terms of what those incentives look like. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that climate change is very different than any other environmental issue that we faced. And I'm going to focus on 4 key differences. And all of these 4 differences really create, pun intended, a climate of inaction among policymakers. And that is the uphill battle. So there is a big fear among people working in the policy space that there will never be enough incentive for policymakers to do the quote-unquote right thing. And this is where, really, I think organizations like MIT alumni, alumni of other prominent schools, really play a key role in lobbying your policymakers to do the right thing. And if you don't, the deck is stacked against action in this space. So what are the differences? So the first one is that what we call greenhouse gas, or what we call a global pollutant. And this really is the most important one. And what do we mean by a global pollutant? So if I release a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere in Palo Alto, California, that does the same exact thing as if I released that ton of CO2 in Beijing, China. That it doesn't matter where you emit the pollution, it has the same impact regardless. That is very different than any other environmental issue that we faced. You could argue ozone, the hole in the ozone layer was somewhat similar. But think about sulfur dioxide. A ton of sulfur dioxide released in California is likely to do the most damage inside California. So what that means is that if I'm a state that has an acid rain problem, I have the incentive, all the incentive in the world, the correct incentive to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions. And the same is true for particulate matter, for VOCs and NOx that are precursors to smog. All of those pollutants tend to do the most damage where they are emitted. So that means policymakers bear the burden of that pollution. The smog in LA puts pressure on policymakers in LA and policymakers in Sacramento to clean up the smog. The CO2 in the atmosphere doesn't put pressure on any one government. Right? And in fact, what it does is it creates an incentive to free ride. China wants, even US wants everybody else to do something and sit around on the sidelines and have all the other countries bear the costs of their reductions, and we get a big chunk of the benefits from those reductions. About 90% of the benefits that come from reducing CO2 emissions in the US go to non-US countries. Okay? Don't tell the president that. Okay? I hope he doesn't watch these videos. So this is in economics, this is a classic tragedy of the commons. That everyone, so in the tragedy of the commons, think about fishing. Nobody owns the ocean. Everybody overfishes the ocean. In this case, everybody overpollutes CO2. Because most of the damages from your pollution aren't borne by yourself. Okay? The other important thing is that the US and Europe is playing a smaller and smaller role in this debate or in this issue. So these are projected emissions out to 2040, and you can see that the OECD countries in blue, their emissions are projected to be fairly constant most of the increase is coming from China, India, and Africa. So that means we're going to have less and less ability to influence the climate going forward. And that's important because if we don't get the structure in place now, one can imagine that India is not going to be that interested in reducing their CO2 emissions when they're worried about getting air conditioning to their population. And they're worried about just getting electricity on all the time. Right? The second difference here from other pollution, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, etc., is that much of the damages, not all, but much of the damages are really far in the future. Okay, so this is projected damages from climate change out to 2100. Annual damages. What that means is the people who are going to be most harmed by climate change aren't at the negotiation table. Right? So that's fine. You might think, well, maybe policymakers will at least argue on their behalf, right? And be worried about what people in 2100 are going to think about their legacy. That's not my vision of typical policymakers, right? They're more worried about 2018 than 2100, okay? So that, again, creates this climate of inaction because nobody's fighting on their behalf, at least in the policy arena. The third one, perhaps just as important from a PR standpoint, is that with climate change, there's no smoking gun. Okay, the recent hurricane activity, Carrie Emanuel was probably here some point in the past, who argued that climate change increases not only the frequency but the strength of hurricanes. And we know that. We can say that in a probabilistic standpoint. But you can never point to any one hurricane and say that's because of climate change. So contrast that with other environmental issues. When people think about particulate matter or smog, when I think about it, I see pictures like this. Right? That's a salient feature of smog. That's something that resonates with everybody. When I think about acid rain, I think about this. You could point to the fish and the acid coming down and polluting riverways and lakes and so on. When I think about an oil spill, perhaps the easiest, I think about this. Right? Again, these are environmental issues that when people see this, they immediately point to the environmental issue. When I think about climate change, I think about this. Just doesn't have quite the effect as this one right here. Right? There's no poster child of damage from climate change, partly because a lot of the damages are out in the future. Right? Again, there's not something that you can point to in any one instance. The last one, and this is where I'm going to try to be a little provocative, and that is it's going to be really, really hard to get off of fossil fuels. Okay, and I noticed somebody from Tesla, and I noticed somebody from some other renewables. The simple fact of the matter is a gallon of gasoline is a beautiful compound. The energy density, the ability to transport it from one location to the next, the sheer amount of oil that we have at our disposal, it is the perfect fuel, except for one little thing, that it leads to 20 pounds of CO2 when you burn it. Right? So, and natural gas as a way to generate electricity and so on. That the fossil fuels we use are great at what they do, except for that one little problem with climate change. So in a recent paper, we asked ourselves, let's put policy aside for a second. Is there any evidence, if we look back at the data, is there any evidence that the market itself can wean ourselves off of fossil fuels? Okay? And as economists, if you ask that question, an economist is going to focus on one of two things, either supply or demand. Right? That's the only thing we do. Everything can be reduced down to supply and demand. So is there any evidence that we'll ever run out of fossil fuels on the supply side? Okay? And then is there any evidence that we'll run out of the demand for fossil fuels? So it might sound funny to run out of the supply of fossil fuels these days, but actually in our past we've been in periods of time where we were sure we were running out of oil, right? Whether it was 1973 or as recently as 2008. I was in California in 2008, and I could say everybody was talking about peak oil. That's it. It's over. We better adopt hydrogen fuel cell vehicles or electric vehicles, because sure enough, there won't be oil in 10 years. Right? And the same was true in the 70s. In 1977, a very well-known policymaker said that we will more than likely run out of oil in the next 10 years. Does anyone know who that was? Jimmy Carter. He was a little wrong, okay? But maybe there's some evidence in the data that we'll run out of oil. So what we did is we actually went to BP, who's a sponsor of the MIT Energy Initiative, and they gave us access to their BP Annual Energy Outlook, I think it's called. And we were able to go all the way back to 1955. And each year, since 1955, BP has added up all of the reserves of oil. And starting in the 70s, added up all the reserves of coal and natural gas. And we just look at the data. So a reserve, if you don't know that definition, and BP's definition is a little bit more lax than the SEC, but a reserve is meant to be any fossil fuel that's in the ground that we could take out of the ground at prevailing technology and costs and prices. Okay? Now, why might reserves change? So from one year to the next, reserves are going to change. There's three things that are going on. Clearly, we use fossil fuels. So you burn a barrel of oil, that means technically there's one fewer barrels of oil in the ground. So that'll tend to shrink fossil fuels. But that is countered by the fact that we get better at finding oil each year. So there might have been a barrel of oil in the ground that we didn't know about last year. And also we get better at taking oil out of the ground. So maybe we couldn't take that barrel out of the ground at current prices last year, but now we can. So in a nutshell, reserves of fossil fuels is a constant fight between demand and technology. Okay? So basically what we were asking, what the data are going to tell us is who's winning that battle, demand or technology. So this is since 1980. Let me focus on the bottom because the top one's really scary. The bottom two, gray is oil, black is natural gas. And what you notice is it's a fairly steady upward rise. Okay? In fact, they grow at about 2.5% per year. So what that means is every year we have 2.5% more oil and natural gas at our disposal than we did the previous year, despite the fact that we just burned a bunch of it. Okay? Coal is going down on average, but it's really, really high already. Right? Nobody bothers looking for new coal because that's just doing this. Oh, there's some. Right? That's how it's like in the Powder River. You just do that, and there's some coal. Right? This goes back to 1950 for oil and 1976 for natural gas. So there again, you see this constant march up in the amount of oil that we could take out of the ground at current prices and current technology. And natural gas is the same way. So that should suggest, as a data person, that's pretty strong evidence that we shouldn't hang our hats on, well, we'll run out of oil or natural gas at some point, and we'll have to use something else. Certainly not coal. In fact, another interesting graph is this one. So what this one does is it takes the reserves of the fossil fuel and then divides by how much we used in that year. Okay, so effectively this is, you might think of how many years of oil or natural gas do we have in the ground. And this is really neat because those bottom two are fairly stable at 50 years. So what that's saying is go all the way back to 1980, we always seem to have 50 years of oil and natural gas at our disposal. And this is global, by the way, not just the US. Yes, coal is falling, but we still have 100 years of coal. Okay, so when we get to 50, I think we'll start doing a little R&D to find new coal. But until we get to 50, it looks like the market says you don't have to. Right? So again, that suggests that we shouldn't put our trust in peak oil or peak demand. Okay? Now, how is this happening, right? So I mentioned that this is a constant fight between technology and demand. Well, we're clearly getting better at finding and developing new deposits. And the technology is getting better at taking those out. Right? So we could point to some good examples, some more data. This is this percentage of successful exploratory and development wells. So again, every year we're running out of oil sites to drill, yet we get better, more successful, a higher probability that it'll be a successful drill, whether it's a developmental well or an exploratory well. And in fact, what the geologists tell me, or what the people at Schlumberger tell me, is that fracking now is like farming. It never fails, right? They're so good at telling us what the ground looks like 1,000 or 10,000 feet below the ground, what the rock looks like, that they can drill in one attempt and find oil. Okay, and that's certainly borne out by the data. And that's coming from companies like Schlumberger and Bechtel that are getting better at 3D and 2D seismic technologies, offshore drilling, horizontal drilling. That's what's allowed for fracking to occur. And we're drilling more and more wells each year too. So not only is the probability of a successful well going up, it's not like we're cherry picking. We're actually drilling more wells and it's still going up. Right?
What's a development well?
A development well is you go into a field and it's the first well in that field. An exploratory well is more of a sort of, sample, exactly. So we can point to two major things, and I'll have two potential future developments as well. When Jimmy Carter said that in 1977, tar sands was not oil. Right? Now it is. Okay? Well, it's actually not oil, it's bitumen, but it plays the role of oil. Tar sands tripled Canadians' oil reserves in one fell swoop. Right? And that alone was a 10% bump up in world reserves. Shale gas and shale oil wasn't around in the 70s or 80s, and barely in the 90s. Right? This was a 50% increase in U.S. oil reserves, and has been about a 50% increase or more than a 50% increase in U.S. oil production. And there's a lot of shale, and I'll have a map of this in a second, that's not in the U.S., that hasn't even been exploited. Okay? Two potential things that aren't reserves now because you can't economically convert them into fossil fuels. One is what's called oil shale, which is really scary, which is oil or bitumen, again, trapped in rock. Okay, not shale oil where it's trapped 10,000 feet below the ground in little pockets like a sponge, but trapped in rock where you have to heat up the rock to melt it out. It's much like tar sands where you heat up the sand and that separates the sand from bitumen. You would do the same thing, but now with rock. So anything that's very energy intensive to convert it to fossil fuels is going to be very dirty from a climate change perspective. There's about, the USGS estimates there's about 2.8 trillion barrels of oil shale resources. Again, can't do this economically now, but the concern would be in the future we can. And then what really scares me are what are called methane hydrates. Okay, methane hydrates are like natural gas popsicles at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, where if you go down there and heat them up, they'll bubble up. And so Japan has had a couple demonstration projects where they went down and actually captured the natural gas. Okay, there's a lot of this, and it's everywhere. Okay, not only is it everywhere, well, a corollary of everywhere is that it's also in Asia and Europe, where traditionally they've had very high natural gas prices. Okay, that's why Japan and North Korea are so interested in methane hydrates, is natural gas prices there are often 5 to 8 times more expensive than they are here. So that's your potential supply. That's what's going to keep those two graphs growing at 2.5% per year. Okay? This is what shale oil looks like everywhere else. So right now, the U.S. is really the only country that's doing fracking, but it's not the only country that could. Okay? Now, each other region in the world has something that's keeping it from going on now. Whether it's in water, in China, there's not enough water where their resources are, or in Europe, there's not great institutions for having landowners exploit these resources, or in South America, there might be government instabilities that might keep those. But at some point, you could imagine these resources or reserves being exploited. Okay, so that suggests that we shouldn't hope for the supply curve to shift all the way in. So maybe the demand curve. And in fact, now that's the rage, right? You've heard peak demand. We've gone from peak oil to peak demand. And peak demand is that the demand curve will keep shifting in until nobody wants to buy fossil fuels anymore. So what's the evidence there? So the first thing is, I'll say that we do have historically an example of peak demand, of a demand curve for an energy resource that shifted all the way in so that we don't use it anymore. And this generates one of my favorite cartoons from Vanity Fair in 1861. So you might not know what's going on here, but these are a bunch of whales celebrating the discovery of oil. Right? No longer are they an energy resource. Right? So that's a classic example of peak demand. So it can happen. Okay? Where would it come from? So you could think about either the electricity system or transportation. So on the electricity side, we certainly want to replace coal. How would we do that? We could do that with solar, wind, and in the question answer period, we could talk about nuclear as well. Also on the natural gas side, we would do it on solar and wind. So what we do here is we look at what's called the levelized cost of energy. Okay, so what the levelized cost of energy does, you could do it for any technology, and it just adds up the full lifetime costs of whatever that technology is, okay, and divides it by the full lifetime production. So it's basically a lifetime average cost. Okay, and it's a nice starting point for comparing different technologies. So what I'm going to show you in a second is just take the levelized cost of energy of solar and divide it by the levelized cost of energy for natural gas. And what we want that graph to be is under 1. Right? We want solar to be cheaper than natural gas or wind or nuclear. This is up to, so this, the EIA only had data up to 2014 when we wrote this paper, but you could see that all three of these graphs are still above 1. Okay? Now what the EIA does is it's an average spot in the U.S. Okay, what I'm going to show you in a second is some very exciting recent developments in specific places for solar. Okay? But if we're going to replace natural gas and coal, we can't just have it in the Central Valley of California or in Arizona or Texas. It's got to be enough solar and wind to replace all of coal and natural gas. So when you do that, it still suggests that solar, wind, and certainly nuclear has a way to go. Okay? But we should be excited by that drop. Look at that amazing drop in the cost of solar PV. Okay? That is technological innovation at its finest right there. In fact, there are some spots on the globe where solar can beat natural gas. So these are bids on contracts where a government will put out to bid. They'll say, this is a purchase power agreement where you build a solar farm and they agree to pay you what you bid for every kilowatt hour of electricity that comes from that solar farm. Natural gas is about 3.5 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So here's a spot in the world where solar beats it. 2.5 cents, 2.4 cents. Here's another spot, 2.9 cents. These are all spots. This is very, very exciting stuff. Okay? The problem is it's not, you can't roll it out everywhere. Right? These are in very specific spots in the globe. And the other problem that you may be keeping track of is that, unfortunately, unlike a natural gas turbine, you can't just turn on and off a solar PV array. And it's worse than that. When you turn it on, it also goes up and down. The clouds go over the sun, and all of a sudden, or you get this solar eclipse, something like that, and you've lost 40% of your electricity. And you're seeing that in California, actually. So this is the famous duck curve that everybody's pointing to. And what this is by hour of the day, net demand. Okay, so this is the demand for electricity in California taking out solar. Okay, because solar's happening behind the meter in a lot of these spots. And what you see is, it used to be the case that demand actually peaked here. About 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock every day, that would be your peak demand. Now, if you project out to 2020, demand is way lower during the sunlight period because you're generating so much electricity. That by itself is creating issues, but this steepness is also creating issues. What you need here is a bunch of combined gas turbine or just gas turbines sitting, just waiting to turn on. Okay? So the real comparison that we should be doing is not solar to natural gas, but solar plus batteries to natural gas. And once you do that, solar is still fairly expensive relative to natural gas. Okay? We're working on it at MIT, but that's still the state of the technology. Okay, so that's electricity. So there's certainly reason to be excited, but for small penetration of solar and wind, you basically use the grid as your battery. For large penetrations, you have to actually install batteries. And California is starting to be at that critical point. Germany's already been there for a few years. But what we see now is about 12% of the electricity from California comes from solar. But that's not the right number to focus on. In some hours, 40% of the electricity is coming from solar. Okay, and those are the hours where you have negative prices or stability issues in the grid. Okay, so that's the electricity side. Let's talk about the demand for oil. So here, the big one potential replacement for oil would be electric vehicles. Okay, so we did a very simple calculation. And I have the spreadsheet because I know this graph I'm going to show you is going to upset some of you. So I have the spreadsheet, you can have it, and you can play around with it. But it's, again, something, a back-of-the-envelope calculation that we wanted to think about ourselves, which was, hey, for every price of oil, let's calculate the cost of batteries where an internal combustion engine vehicle would cost the same to own than a pure electric vehicle. Okay, so now we could say, you give me Elon Musk says he can build batteries at $150 a kilowatt hour. I can immediately go to my curve and tell you what oil price we need for that Tesla 3 to beat the Honda Accord. Okay? So that requires assumptions, and that's why I'm more than happy to share the spreadsheet. These were our assumptions. So imagine a driver that drives 15,000 miles a year. Okay? They're paying an interest rate, because we need to discount the future, of 5%. This is about the required kilowatt hours per mile of a Tesla S. Okay? Imagine you wanted that electric vehicle to go 250 miles. Let's credit the electric vehicle for $1,000, okay, for having fewer moving parts. That's something you could certainly play around with. Let's compare it to a Honda Accord that gets about 30 miles per gallon. And let's assume you pay the average retail rate for electricity. So when you do that, you get this nice, pretty picture. Again, what that red line is telling you is that that's cost parity. So on the red line, that Honda Accord costs the same as the equivalent Tesla, scaled down in terms of quality, right, to a Honda Accord. The interesting thing about this is it's almost a slope of 1 from the origin. So what this is saying is that if the price of oil is $50 a barrel, which is right about what it is now, you need battery costs to be about $75 a kilowatt hour. Okay? This is absent subsidies. Okay? This is on just pure social costs. Okay? That suggests that we're still a ways to go on battery costs. Okay? Elon Musk, I believe his goal is $150 a kilowatt hour. Okay? The word on the street is it costs about $200 to $250 a kilowatt hour right now. So that means you need oil to be about $200 a barrel. Okay? We're a little bit away from that right now. Okay? So there again, that means if we just let the market go, we shouldn't hang our hat on peak demand to save the world. Okay? So that steps in. I'm going to come back to that in a second. What will save the planet? Okay? Technology is important, but it's not enough. And that might be surprising coming from somebody at MIT. But even MIT has economists. Some there aren't very happy about that, but we're here. We're a necessary evil in many ways. So what will save the planet? So here's where I go. I was thinking about this, and my son's 9 years old. I just got him to watch Star Wars. So there was a scene in Star Wars where Princess Leia goes to Obi-Wan Kenobi and says, "You're my only hope." You remember that scene? So here it's policy, "You're my only hope." Right? So I picture myself as Obi-Wan Kenobi, basically the economist, or economics, "You're my only hope." And that's what we need. We need technology, but technology alone isn't going to be enough. Okay? If you remember this scene, the next thing Princess Leia does is she looks over her shoulder like she's scared, because she just saw Darth Vader. So the next thing in my mind is, oh crap, Trump was elected. And she runs off, right? So maybe we need to push the pause button for 3.5 more years before we save the planet, but let's at least talk about what we need to do to save the planet. And then, hopefully, and don't worry, I am going to have some uplifting comments. Hopefully we can lay the groundwork for the next 4 years starting in 2020. So what do we need to do? So economists are a broken record here. We all agree on one thing, that we need a price on carbon. Okay? Now, a price on carbon can come in one or two flavors. One is a carbon tax, which I would say, I'm shooting at the dark here, I would say 75% of economists prefer a carbon tax over cap and trade. But a cap and trade is a close cousin to a carbon tax, and it is a price on carbon. We could talk about the differences during discussion, but for now, let's just treat them as one and the same. Unfortunately, not very many places have a price on carbon, and even where we do have a price on carbon, it's way too low. Okay? Except in Sweden, where it's hundreds of dollars, but we're not Swedes. What we do instead are what are called performance standards, and especially California. California loves performance standards. Okay? You've got your renewable portfolio standard. You've got your fuel economy standard. You've got your low carbon fuel standard. You've got all sorts of performance standards. So what we've been doing as economists are thinking through what are the differences between a performance standard and what we like, what we tend to push for. And I'm going to walk you through what those differences are. So first, realize that a performance standard regulates the average of something, not the total of something. Okay? Cap and trade regulates total emissions. A low carbon fuel standard, if you're familiar with that, regulates the average carbon content per gallon of gasoline. A fuel economy standard is the average miles per gallon of all the cars you sell. A renewable portfolio standard is the average amount of electricity that you get from renewables in the grid. So all of those are regulating the average. Okay? The other thing we do is we also hand out money. Okay? So I'll talk about subsidies as well. But let's think through the economics of a performance standard. Okay? Turns out the average is not the total. MIT taught you that, right? So this is what it looks like when you do cap and trade or a carbon tax. This is how firms behave. So a firm operating under a carbon tax or a cap and trade program prices their product at what we call marginal cost. That's the cost of building one more Tesla or one more gallon of gasoline, plus the tax or the required permit prices for that product. Okay, very simple equation. Price equals cost plus the tax. When you do a performance standard, what you end up with is two different potential outcomes. Think about a fuel economy standard. Okay? So automobile manufacturers have to sell cars so that their average fuel economy is 40 miles per gallon. What would happen in that world is if you have a Hummer that gets 12 miles per gallon, what you'll do under a fuel economy standard is internally tax that Hummer. Okay? Why? Because selling one more Hummer puts you out of compliance. So you need extra money to incentivize you to sell anything that's worse than the standard. So anything worse than the standard gets taxed. Okay, by how much it's worse than the standard plus this thing called a shadow value that you probably don't want to remember, but you probably can if you forced yourself. Anything better than the standard, so now you sell a Prius, which is better than the standard, well, a firm's actually willing to sell the Prius at a loss. Why? Because it lets them sell one more Hummer. Okay? So firms operating under a performance standard actually subsidize some of their products. Anything better than the standard gets a subsidy. It's all internal. Okay? And when I teach this to my grad students, I show a flyer from a Ford dealership in the Midwest where the sale is buy an F-150 and get a Ford spec free. That's a pure example of tax subsidy, right? That's what's happening under a performance standard. So although regulating the average seems like it's regulating the total, the incentives are very, very different. Okay? Why does it matter? Because that Prius still leads to CO2 emissions. Whether we like it or not, you have to admit that it does. So now you're subsidizing something that leads to greenhouse gas emissions. Or take the low carbon fuel standard, you end up subsidizing that ethanol. Ethanol still leads to CO2. Okay? So you end up subsidizing stuff that's leading to what you don't like. Okay? You're taxing the bad stuff, but that subsidy drives a wedge between economic efficiency and what you end up doing. So I've spent a lot of my career comparing these types of policies to what we'd like to do, which is a carbon tax or a cap and trade. So let me talk a little bit about some of that research. So this comes from a paper, and I should have mentioned earlier, since some of you are from the hard sciences, in economics we're not that creative. Authors are always alphabetical. Okay, so I don't know if that makes me look good or bad, but it's only because my name starts with a K. Okay, so what we did here is we compared a renewable fuel standard, which we have at the federal level, okay, with a federal low-carbon fuel standard, which we don't have, but we could have, to a cap-and-trade program that achieves the same CO2 reductions from transportation, to subsidizing ethanol, which we used to up until 2012. And the focus here is on how much do these policies cost per ton of CO2 reduced? Right? That's what we should always be focusing on. Right? How much does society pay for this policy for every ton of CO2 that it gets rid of? So that's this bottom row here. So the renewable fuel standard, which we have, costs $60 a ton to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. The low carbon fuel standard, which California has, is a little bit better, but it costs $50 a ton. Getting the same reduction from a carbon tax or a cap and trade program would only cost $20 a ton. And if you subsidize, it's even worse. It's $80 a ton. So all three of these expensive policies are the ones we do. The cheap one is the one we don't. Okay? So the next time California policymaker wants some standard, think about this table. And fuel economy standards are even worse. Mark Jacobson, not the one at Stanford, but Mark Jacobson at UC San Diego has done a lot of work on CAFE standards, and he shows that they're often 10 times more expensive than cap and trade or a carbon tax. Okay? Why do we rely on them? Two reasons. One is they do a great job at hiding the cost. Okay? Because you're subsidizing something. So the net impact of a tax and a subsidy is basically nothing at the price of a pump, but it's happening more upstream than that. Okay? What we did in this paper is we looked at another potential reason. Not only do these other policies hide the cost, but an interesting thing about these other policies is although the average cost is higher, it has this really wide distribution where you get a lot of medium losers, but you get a few huge winners. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like. So this is cap and trade. So we're able to, and I'm happy to talk more about this paper, but we can go county by county and calculate what the average gain or loss is for that county under all of these policies. So more green means that county's winning, actually gaining from the policy. So the typical county under cap and trade loses about $20 per person per year. But in some areas, the green areas, they're actually winning. Okay? Does anyone know what state that is? Iowa. Right? I think. I'm an economist, not a geographer. It's around Iowa.
That was up and to the left.
Okay, up and to the left. Yeah, the more green area. Yeah, that's Illinois. No, I'm going there next week. So why are they winning? Because under a renewable fuel standard, you sell more ethanol. And even under cap and trade or carbon tax, you would sell more ethanol. So there are counties under cap and trade that would gain $500 per person per year because it would incentivize more ethanol. Let me show you what a renewable fuel standard looks like. There are counties under a renewable fuel standard that gain $6,000 per person per year under the renewable fuel standard, because it leads to so much more ethanol than cap and trade. It's basically getting all the carbon reductions from leaning on ethanol instead of just driving fewer miles. Okay? So now think about what are the economics. So under cap and trade, a bunch of counties are going to lose $20 per person per year. Under a renewable fuel standard, those same counties will lose $100. So an $80 difference. Are they going to write their congressman over $80? and say, we need to do cap and trade? Probably not. But this county right here, who under cap and trade gains $500 per person per year, but under a renewable fuel standard gains $6,000 per person per year, I bet you they write their congressman and say, you know what, we need this renewable fuel standard thing. So the political economy is stacked against the right policy. Because although it's on average worse, it creates big, big winners. And we actually show, this is where you might be skeptical, but we actually show our simulated gains and losses predicted who voted for and against Waxman-Markey in 2008. And we control for your political party, we control for what your electricity system looks like, and we can show that those that were going to gain a lot under the renewable fuel standard were more likely to vote against Waxman-Markey, because it had a provision in there that would relax the renewable fuel standard. So policymakers and voters are, and we also show that how much you're going to gain or lose predicts voter or political contributions as well. So whether it's Joe Schmo writing a check to their congressman, maybe not, but it's probably Cargill or ADM or some of the large ethanol producers. So that was the straw that sort of convinced us that we had it right. Once it predicts political behavior, you're pretty sure you got it right. Okay? All right, so how do we fix it? Okay? So this is the positive part of the talk. I told you I promised I'd get to there. So I see up to three paths for a carbon tax. The one I think has a lot of promise, which is, especially now, blue states, a lot of blue states, or a few blue states are doubling down on climate change. So if we can get them to double down on a price on carbon, or a carbon tax, then they'll serve as a demonstration project for the rest of the US, so that 4 years from now, if Massachusetts has a carbon tax and their economy hasn't imploded, which it wouldn't, politicians can point to it as the guide for federal policy. Right? And in some ways, your California cap and trade program is doing that, but it's so low and you have so many other policies, it's hard to point to cap and trade as really doing anything other than just filling in for those other policies. The second one, which would be kind of neat, but it might also cause harm to the US, so I have mixed feelings here, is if a bunch of other countries just start doing border adjustments for their carbon taxes, and then that sort of pushes us into a carbon tax ourselves. Okay? I doubt that. That's probably the least likely. The last one, and this is something that I've been working on, and there's been a few high-profile climate groups that have come out with similar proposals, what I was calling the Grand Compromise, which is how do we get Republicans on board? And so one idea I had was, well, they don't like carbon taxes, but they hate fuel economy standards. So why don't we replace something they hate with something they don't like? Right? Seems like a win-win, right? So take the renewable fuel standard, take fuel economy standards, take the Clean Power Plan, which is now defunct, but replace it with a carbon tax that starts out at a level that achieves the same reductions as all of those other federal policies. Okay? Remember, those other policies are 3 to 10 times more expensive. So you can achieve the same reduction and save the economy a bunch of money. I would hope that would resonate well with Republicans. Unfortunately, the state of Washington, I'm sure somebody will bring this up, state of Washington showed us that the environmentalists are now the group. If you go my Grand Compromise, now you're going to have to fight the environmentalists because they don't like that compromise. Okay, so we'll talk maybe in discussion how we get them on board. So I've done some work using MIT's what's called the EPA model, which is this large-scale computer general equilibrium model, and just ask the question, how large would that carbon tax have to be to replace those policies? Okay? And it turns out not very high. So in 2020, now this is cheating because the Clean Power Plan didn't start till 2020. So this is just replacing CAFE standards and the Renewable Fuel Standard. A carbon tax of $7 is all you need. 2025, $21. Still reasonable. So $7, so to put this in perspective, that's basically a 7 cents gasoline price tax. 2030, $36. These are still below what's called the social cost of carbon, which we could talk about later as well. So these are very, very reasonable low numbers. So there's actually a couple ways you can think about this. One is, wow, these are so low, it should be easy to get Republicans on board. The other way is, wow, we're not doing crap, right? We're only doing $7 worth. CAFE standards and the Renewable Fuel Standards are only doing $7 worth of stuff. That just shows you how inefficient they are. Right? That they are burdensome. They get so much political pressure against them, even though they're not doing that much in terms of saving CO2 emissions.
Is that $7
per ton of CO2? Sorry.
And in today's dollars?
Yes. Yeah. So that seems like we can get a lot of Republicans on board. Okay, and in fact, not the Charles Schultz professor, but on the George P. Schultz professor, he has the same plan. Okay, and I had dinner. Actually, when they gave me the George Schultz professorship a couple years ago, I was talking to him about that. This is what I talked about when I accepted the chair. He was there. So we've had a number of conversations about this. From my perspective, nobody has more Republican street cred than George P. Schultz. Right? So if he's on board with this, others should as well. Okay? But for now, I think, for the next 4 years, I think we could still lay the groundwork for these demonstration projects. Okay? And it was mentioned so it turns out that one of my neighbors is a state senator at Massachusetts. We walk our dogs every day together almost. We started talking about what we do, and it turned out that he already had a carbon, this was about 3 years ago, he already had the workings of a carbon tax bill. Now there's 2 bills on the Senate floor. His bill doesn't replace those other policies with the carbon tax, but it's what he calls a fee and dividend program, because he can't use the word tax, where all the money comes in and then it immediately goes out per household in terms of annual checks. Right? So that the money never goes into the government pocketbooks. Okay? And that's very similar to Secretary Schultz's plan, where I actually think it goes into the Social Security Fund, or it goes into a fund separate from the federal government. And then each year you divide by the number of households. That gives you an annual check, and you send those checks out. Okay? So that's either called a tax and dividend program or a fee and dividend program. There's another carbon tax on the floor that uses some of the money to subsidize green technologies. Okay, and I'm happy to talk about the pros and cons of those bills, but I'll say that they're gaining steam. Okay, so I've had the pleasure of speaking to the entire Massachusetts State Senate. I've had the pleasure to speak with the Senate President. Couple weeks I'll be speaking with him again, this time with business leaders. So it does seem to be gaining some steam. And actually, I think it's Rhode Island and Connecticut who have bills on their floors that basically read, if any big state around us adopts a carbon tax, we'll adopt a carbon tax. Right? So it could really be this domino effect, literally. So that's where I think the key positive outlook is over the next 4 years. After that, depending on who gets elected or reelected, you could imagine, again, these state policies really catalyzing the federal government to do something with the carbon tax. So I'm going to end my talk with my license plate. Tax CO2.
Chris, that was great. We have some questions online. I believe you've covered some of the substance, but I'm going to ask just a couple of detailed ones, and then I'm going to ask our handy-dandy microphone assistants to go among you and hand you microphones so you can ask your own questions. Turns out Chris is uniquely qualified to field your questions because he started his career as a pro baseball player. At least he thought he was going to be a pro baseball player, but he didn't get out of college. So he can field a grounder or a liner. One of the questions was, what do you think of the Climate Leadership Council climate dividends plan that Exxon, BP, Shell, and Total endorse, or the Citizens Climate Lobby carbon fee and dividend? I think we've heard some of that.
Yeah, the first one is Secretary Schultz's plan with Jim Baker. And so that's where, again, there's two key ingredients to those plans. One is it's a tax and dividend program. Okay, so all the money gets sent out as checks, annual checks. And then the second key is that it explicitly gets rid of some of these other policies. So the one thing I did want to bring up at some point is, what do you do with the money? What's the best thing to do with the money, right? So you put in a $40 carbon tax. It brings in a few $100 billion a year. What's the best way? So the economists would say the first best thing is if you could use that revenue to reduce bad taxes, distortionary taxes, as we call them, like income taxes and sales taxes. That would be the first best, right? Because on the one hand, the carbon tax is what should be in place. So you're taxing something that you should be taxing, and you're getting rid of taxes that you shouldn't be taxing, right? So you get this double dividend, and that could actually spur economic growth and reduce the net cost of that policy. So that would be the best outcome, but of course, we got to take into account politics. And my hunch is a tax and dividend program that just sends it back in the form of checks is way more political feasible than actually than trusting Congress to reduce your income tax.
And there was another question here. What do you think of the idea of charging fossil fuel companies for past pollution, as suggested by a recent study tracing emissions to major carbon producers?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't even know if that would be legal. But I think that would certainly kill any carbon tax plan, right? If part of the plan is we're also going to tax you for past emissions. So again, politically, that seems like a non-starter. And in the economics, it doesn't even make sense from the economics as well.
Okay. Some of these questions are almost sociology. So I'll let the audience...
Economists do sociology.
Yeah, well...
We do every social science.
I'm going to ask if the audience has any questions first. And Chris, why don't you just pick, from the audience as you go forward?
I'll pick near the mic. How about that?
Thanks. So with the carbon tax on transportation, how would you implement it? So with the CAFE standards, it's like, okay, I've got X number of major auto manufacturers, and each one of them has to have achieved the standard. So it's very easy to measure and monitor.
Yeah.
How do you do that for a carbon tax on transportation?
It's just as easy, right? So we already have state and federal taxes on a per gallon basis. So you could do it at the station level, which we already have the infrastructure in place to tax gasoline, or you could do it at what we often like to do is tax where there's the fewest companies, just so there's fewer people to tax. So at the refining level or the blender level. And that's where actually the renewable fuel standard is implemented at the blender level. So we're already regulating blenders in a way that would be very similar to a carbon tax.
Got it.
So you talked about Washington State. It's a blue state.
Yeah.
And it had exactly this kind of plan, a very modest step towards exactly what you're talking about. What happened?
So the environmentalist groups either explicitly fought it or certainly didn't come out in favor of it. And that's because it was going to replace other things like the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or they don't have any fuel regulation there, but it was mostly subsidies for green technologies. And environmentalists balked at that. So again, you know, another way to think about it, so remember, so this is $7 achieves the same reduction as those three policies, the first two at least. You could flip this around and say, well, let's set the tax that leads to the same burden on the economy, right? And since these other policies, let's just take for granted that they're 5 times more expensive. Well, then you could set a tax that's $35 a ton, and you would have the same drag on the economy. So maybe that's the way to sell it to the environmentalists, is we're not going to replace, we're going to do more than replace those other policies with the carbon tax. We're going to set the carbon tax that costs the same amount as those other policies. And because those other policies are so inefficient, that carbon tax actually ends up being pretty high. Somebody over... I don't like doing this. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's been in the paper lately around here. There's Assemblyman Phil Ting in San Francisco proposing that California not allow the sale of,
following Sweden and France.
Gasoline and...
So I haven't looked at that proposal. I know the Swedish or the French one was, you know, you read the fine print and it was a pure ICE. One of them was a pure internal combustion engine, so hybrids would still count. Right? So I don't know if, again, this is by 2040. I would prefer that and I would expect that if you put the right carbon tax on, by 2040 we wouldn't be driving internal combustion engines either. Or we would be driving what I actually think is the sweet spot of technology, which are plug-in hybrids. Right? That get so if you look at the distribution of trips, about 80% of our trips are below 20 miles. So when you have a pure electric vehicle, you are wasting a lot of money in the battery 80% of the time. You've sized the battery to go a distance that you only go 20% of the time. A plug-in hybrid basically sizes the battery for the vast majority of your trips and then gives you a fallback for those longer trips. Yeah, they're slightly less efficient because you're carrying around more weight and stuff, but they're much more cost effective. So I could imagine us sitting in the plug-in hybrid space for another 30 years or so. Alaska.
Yes. This year, the California legislature passed an increase in the gas tax from 18 cents to 30 cents. And then, to support a cap-and-trade program, there's a 63-cent tax coming on top of the gasoline tax, I believe. And I was wondering if you could comment or elaborate on how the California cap-and-trade program maybe doesn't do that much, or...
I don't think it would be 63 cents.
No, it's 63 cents a gallon.
To do what?
For the cap-and-trade in California, in the state of California. That's coming.
Yeah, so the beauty of gasoline is when you burn a gallon of gasoline, it leads to 19.6 pounds of CO2 in the atmosphere. So if you quote something on a per ton basis, $30 a ton, you can basically convert that into pennies, and that's the gas tax. So at $12 a ton for permits, which is what California is at right now, that's about a 12 cents a gallon tax. So I follow this fairly close. There might be something out there that I don't know about, but that seems very, very high to me.
Maybe someone else in the audience knows about the cap and trade and that tax.
So with a carbon tax on fossil fuels, what do you see as what we do about non-fossil fuel sources of carbon, such as decomposing organic matter and agriculture?
Oh, agriculture. So they almost always get a free pass, right? There is momentum for taxing methane. Usually we dealt with agricultural agriculture through offsets so that companies can get out of their cap and trade requirements or their tax requirements by doing something in ag that would reduce CO2. That is often, since I'm on tape here, often doesn't lead to reductions that you expect, right? Because those have to be incremental. You would have had to have not done it except for that offset. Not often you're just counting offsets on stuff you've already done. Right? So put ag aside. Any other greenhouse gas emission can be taxed. Right? So nitrous oxide that comes from fertilizer could be embedded in the cost of fertilizer. Right? In principle, you could tax a cow by its average emissions per year. You should definitely tax fugitive emissions from methane coming from natural gas wells. So that's, we have easily convertible numbers that convert it from whatever the greenhouse gas is to its carbon dioxide equivalent. Oh, okay, one on this side. I could never be Phil Donahue.
A couple of questions, if I may. The first one, your chart where you're comparing the cost of oil to the cost of kilowatt per hour.
Yeah.
The oil industry gets some subsidies. Can you talk to us to, first of all, how easy is it to estimate how much subsidies they get and what would be the true price of oil if those subsidies did not exist?
Yeah.
My second question goes more about, the cost of inaction. One thing is, sure, the price of, oil or coal may be still better than the price of renewables, but what about the cost of not acting on climate change?
Okay, so I'm glad the second question is easy answer. I'll come back to that. So it's definitely true that fossil fuel industry gets subsidies. I think it's hard to, what the subsidy that matters is the per barrel or per gallon subsidy. Right? If I give Exxon or BP $1 million, $10 million, just as a lump sum, that doesn't do anything. That doesn't lead them to sell more oil. So what you need to focus on, so you see these numbers where they get $2 a gallon worth of subsidies. That's not the right number. The right number is on a per gallon basis, what do they get? And I'm blanking on the numbers, but Gib Metcalf at Tufts has done some work on this. If you email me, I can send them the work. I think the biggest subsidy they get is accelerated depreciation on capital, right? And that certainly moves their behavior. So that is certainly has to be on the table. Everyone on a level playing field, right? For sure. The second point, the cost of inaction is in the cost. So there's something called the social cost of carbon. And that actually now is on the federal book. So anytime the EPA does something that reduces CO2, one of the benefits is the social cost of carbon times the amount of CO2 that it reduces. Where does that number come from? That number comes from a bunch of modeling, which basically asks the question, if I release a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, what is the present discounted value of the cost of that ton over the full life of the ton? So it incorporates the cost of inaction. In fact, the whole point is you release it and let it be released. That number, it's a very hard exercise to do, and there's a big distribution, a wide distribution, but the average of that distribution is about $40 a ton. So that would be implicit. And if you think that's too low, you might think it's too low, then that cost of inaction should be in that number. However, if you calculate it correctly. Okay. Right there.
Sorry, I had the mic just now. Actually, I was going to say after the previous question, maybe we need some emission standards for cows.
But
my question
carbon capture
was,
and methane capture and sequestration.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But my question was actually, it seems to me that a carbon tax will be inherently a regressive one. So what other kinds of policy fixes could we adopt to make sure that carbon tax doesn't overburden poor people? Because I think of it like a nationwide sales tax.
Yeah, I'm glad. So I spend my life worrying about two things: efficiency and regressivity. It's a boring life, I know. It turns out that a tax and dividend program is progressive. Because you're giving every household the same amount of money. And low-income households, on average, spend less on CO2 or use less CO2 than wealthy households. So every model I've ever seen finds it slightly progressive.
But as a fraction of their income?
Yeah, as a fraction of their income, exactly. And it also turns out, and this is something I've been recently looking at, fuel economy standards are regressive. Okay, and certainly subsidies are as terrible as you can imagine, right? Low-income households are not putting solar panels on their apartment rooftop, right? And they're not buying Teslas, okay? So handing out money for these cool technologies is one of the most regressive ways to reduce CO2. So I actually think a tax and dividend program would move us in the, you're right for worrying about that. And it would actually move us in the right direction.
Question about carbon sequestration. Presumably, if you advocate a positive tax on emissions, you would also advocate, buying down carbon with sequestration. How close are we with the prices you're talking about to having that actually change anyone's behavior?
Right.
Even if in principle the government pays $12 to take a ton out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, so it depends on who you talk to. If you go over to the CCUS, Low Carbon Energy Center on campus, I think they say that they can do it at $50 to $60 a ton. So we're not that far, at $40 a ton, you're not that far away, right? Now, there's still a lot of work to do, and one of the low carbon energy centers is a carbon capture and sequestration program. So we're pushing those costs down, but bear in mind, without a carbon tax, you never have an incentive to sequester carbon. The only value of sequestering carbon is getting out of tax liability. So that's really the, absent requiring it, that's the only way you're ever going to incentivize. And maybe the right carbon tax is the carbon tax that leads to carbon capture and sequestration.
What about the permafrost that's releasing methane? Who gets taxed for that?
Nobody now, right?
No, I mean like in this future world, like that was in the past, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough one. That's a good, so in principle you could tax the landowner. That probably wouldn't go over well.
Also because they're losing their land at the same time.
Right. Or their house is sinking, one of the two. Yeah, that's a good, that's a good point. And that's where, this 2-degree goal is set in large part because of these sort of negative spillovers. So I guess the first best world is you get that carbon tax in place so that doesn't happen.
Maybe we have to add that to the narrative to sell it harder.
Well, so let me back up a little. One thing that the permafrost melting would do is it would raise the social cost of carbon. So that's one mechanism where it would at least incorporate that sum. But in an ideal world, that never happens.
Oh, hi there. It sounds like you need some new things to worry about.
Okay. Always do. I have a 9-year-old. Does that count?
We've got islands like Puerto Rico or Hawaii that are totally powered by diesel.
Yeah.
And obviously polluting up the yin-yang. Is there any way to use them as demonstration sites when they get rebuilt to sort of model out and prove out some of the things you're proposing here?
Yeah, in fact, a group of us just had a conversation about that, whether we could use Puerto Rico as a demonstration project for something. Certainly Hawaii's, 1 in 9 homes in Hawaii have solar panels. So it's not all diesel. And the beauty of diesel is it's expensive and it attracts solar. So it's sort of this self-fulfilling mechanism. Puerto Rico is a good question. I don't have a great answer for you. The one thing I'll say is, do you really want to do long-term capital investments as demonstration projects in a place that gets hit by hurricanes a lot, right? So, certainly that's not going to give you much data on the resiliency of solar panels or wind turbines. So that's the one thing that, but clearly we should take this opportunity as an opportunity to build up their infrastructure in some way. Oh, is that a Stanford shirt?
MIT undergrad.
Okay.
So you pointed out that there's going to be a demand for storage.
Yeah.
But there's also a link if you have electric cars, fully electric ones.
Right.
You can do a lot of load shifting.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
then you can even conceivably
go the other way.
Use the storage in the car to
Right.
put energy back into the grid.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the economic impact of that? And isn't
Yeah.
that more reason why we should be shifting quicker to electric cars?
It is. That's a definitely benefit of electric vehicles, is that you basically, a lot of the capital cost of that battery is going towards something else, so you can smooth it up across multiple uses. You're sitting right next to somebody from Tesla, I see. We can ask Tesla whether or not they would like to use their batteries that are under their warranty to be load shifted, to be injecting electricity into the grid. My hunch is the OEMs don't want that, right? So you probably couldn't use the battery to inject electrons into the grid, but you could with smart charging back off and so on. So that is part, so the MIT is doing the future of the mobility study right now, and that's one of the research topics of that study is to understand what are the synergies of electric vehicles with the grid and with renewables. So I'll give you an answer in a couple of years, probably, maybe. Yeah. That side?
You gave a lot of thought to how you can get these policies implemented, perhaps just by walking your dog in the morning. But this is working at the Senate level. But as your chart showing the counties demonstrated, to make it work in the U.S., you have to have a groundswell. And the numbers here don't seem to indicate that there would be a great winner in this that would create a lobbying for it. So how do you, looking ahead, see a way of moving this forward through a political process?
So I've started an economics political action committee. We have the EPAC, I'm calling it. We're not that powerful. Yeah, that's where I think it's got to be this compromise where you're getting rid of these other policies. Right? And I understand that what that means is the county that's gaining under the renewable fuel standard isn't going to like that compromise either, right? Because you're getting rid of a policy that injects a lot of revenue into that county. So, our old hope used to be that it would be part of some larger tax reform. That seems to be going out the window. So I think our only hope really is to a groundswell of support for efficiency and for talking to policymakers and convincing them that they could do the same thing that they're doing right now at 1/5 the cost. Or, on the left-leaning policymakers, they could do 5 times the savings in CO2 with current costs. And there's got to be some happy medium where everybody gets, everybody benefits. But it's not easy. And I think even the state-level policymakers who are on record saying that they'll vote for a carbon tax realize that they'll take a political hit for this. And it's admirable to those policymakers to realize that they're willing to do this because they know it's the right thing. You talk to some of these state senators and they realize that they have, they could do this once in one of their terms. They could do something that their constituency doesn't want them to do, but they could convince them that it's not going to be that bad. So maybe the state demonstration projects go in that direction as well. But I wish I had all the answers.
I'm curious about how to balance the policy and the technology. I'm wondering, if the carbon tax is trying to push people use more renewable energy, or trying to ask them to have less emission, do some technology change on their the process of getting the power.
Yeah.
So how to balance that?
Well, so that, you know, the beauty of a carbon tax is it pushes in every direction we want, right? So if you think about you institute a $40 ton carbon tax, 40 cents a gallon. Let's just take transportation. I immediately drive fewer miles. That saves on CO2. Okay? I immediately have more of an incentive, maybe it's small, but I have more of an incentive to keep my engine running well so that it doesn't consume as much gasoline. When I go to buy the next car, I immediately have an incentive to buy a more fuel-efficient car. And all this is in data. I could show you papers that we've written that document this. I even had a graduate student at UC Davis show that when gas prices went up, the housing prices in bedroom communities fell. So that means it puts pressure on where people live and work, right? And it immediately incentivizes the automobile manufacturers to do more R&D in fuel economy. So everything we want to occur happens with the carbon tax. When you do a fuel economy standard, think about this. You somehow move me from my Audi Q7, okay, I'm self-righteous because of my license plate, not because of the car, into a Prius. What do? You've now moved me into a car that's cheaper to drive. This too is documented with data. I now drive more miles. That's called rebound. That doesn't happen under a carbon tax because the cost per mile to drive always goes up. Right? So all of these other policies have these unintended consequences that fight against where we're trying to move to, other than a carbon tax.
Batteries, life for a battery is not that long. So for a battery itself, it may have pollution too, right?
Yeah. So what is not in these calculations is the disposal of batteries, actually. So when people see these assumptions, the immediate pushback from the EV crowd is that you're not giving the EVs enough of a savings, okay? But what I push back with that is, yeah, but I'm also not charging them for the disposal of the battery. Right? So I think that's more of a wash. So these carbon taxes have to be at either every level of a product's life or what's called the life cycle emissions of the product.
If this tax is not global, how much of the carbon emissions will just move overseas in your model?
Yeah. So that's a good, like I said, that $40 number is about $7 is US and the rest is global. So you certainly worry about it flowing to China, although China's starting to price carbon in some of its provinces. Europe, if we adopted a US carbon tax, Europe would follow suit pretty quickly. So at that point, maybe you don't have to worry about China as much. You still have to worry about India. I doubt they're going to adopt a carbon tax anytime soon. But we usually don't worry about leakage or those sorts of issues, jobs going to India, right? So I don't think it would be a huge impact. The other thing you can do, of course, is do a border adjustment so that the products can't go to China, because if they get sold back into here, they get taxed anyways. Right? So I think there's ways to counteract that.
One more question.
Okay. Who's got the highest hand?
Joe, can you switch the slides?
You talked about the problems with the average standards. California's a big fan of minimum performance standards.
Right.
I'm sure do a lot of those. How much better is the story than the 3 to 5 times worse?
So give me an example of a minimum performance standard. So these are just, the refiner has to be at least as efficient as X?
Or, in the electric grid, air conditioner needs to perform at a minimum.
Oh, okay, so appliances and things like that?
Appliances, building energy efficiency codes.
Yeah, so the cost of a banning incandescent light bulbs or banning a air conditioner that's less efficient than X is that you won't care about these costs, but I'm going to tell you what the economists care about, which is that some products people rarely use. And, a room air conditioner that gets turned on once a year, If you force that person to buy a very efficient room air conditioner, that's a waste, right? Because it wasn't using that much CO2 in the first place. So that's the cost of those, okay? They tend not to be as costly as performance standards because you're also not moving behavior that much either. So they're not as costly, but the benefits aren't as large either. So, you know, I'm okay with appliance standards, especially for the fact that consumers know what price of gasoline they pay. They know what fuel economy of their car is. You ask a consumer what the efficiency rating of their air conditioner is, their SEER rating. I have a SEER of 14. What that means, they have no idea. You ask them what electricity price is, they have no idea. So there are additional market failures there other than just CO2, which is information. So those tend to be really targeted towards fixing those market failures, and they have this tangential benefit of also reducing CO2.
Thank you, Chris. At this point, I'd like to introduce our fearless leader, Doug Spring, who has something for Chris, and we'll talk about upcoming events. And then, Chris, you might have a few more minutes for one-on-one questions after we're done with the...
I'm flying out tonight.
Yeah, he needs to go.
So first of all,
great.
Our usual gift is a classic bottle of Cabernet from California. This is Ridge 2013, and I know you'll enjoy it because I've already had it. It's really, really good. I have one question for you.
Sure.
Would you be willing to show the audience and the camera your socks?
Oh, well, I like socks, so.
And they match his tie. That's what you have to see. It's just unbelievable how the color coordinated. Wow. Anyways, thank you, Chris, very much. Okay. So, real quickly, coming attraction going to be right here at Park. On December 6th will be grid storage for renewables integration. And we're going to have some really heavy hitters at this. So be looking for the promotions for this event, and sure hope to see you all back here for that one. I want to really thank Park. Our new professional sponsor, if you will, or host, is Jesse Robest. Jesse couldn't be here tonight, so Mahati Chintapalli, who's in the audience here. Mahati, you want to raise your hand? Right. There she is. There she is. If you have any questions about Park for Mahati, she'll be right here for a little while later after the performance is over. A quick word about what Park does. First of all, they do a lot of research for companies that contract for that research. A lot of top-notch researchers here in a number of different areas, and Mahati is one of them, by the way. And so this is one of the things Park does, but it does more than that. It also incubates startups and helps them in other ways. Is another thing. So if you have a company you're thinking of starting and you want to think about a place to do it, this could be considered. And finally, they're always looking for top-notch employees. So if you're thinking of making a career change, think of Park as well. Okay? And then I lastly want to thank all the MIT Club of Northern California volunteers, without whom we couldn't do this. Greg Dieguez, who is our event manager. Stand up and take a bow, Greg. Hank Magnuski, who does the video recording, is up there in the booth. Phil Murray, our wonderful photographer, who is memorializing the event that way as well. And then the other ones who welcomed you and also helped with the Q&A. I just want to make a final word about tonight is that there, in some respects, you think like, wow, is there ever any way we're going to come through with all of this? I think Chris came up with some really, really good ideas for what we could do, perhaps, to help keep things moving along, regardless of what the political climate is for now and some of the future. But I also want to say, just in general, having done this for almost 8 years now, this is our 8th season for me personally, this was one of the best presented, thorough presentations that I've ever seen in this series, and the questions from the audience were some of the best I've ever heard as well. So let's thank Chris one more time for a fabulous job.